My name is Michael Jenkins. I work for Bridgend County Borough Council, and I'm going to talk you through a mine water scheme that we've been developing probably since about 2015 in the village of Caerau, which is a village at the top of the Lindsey Valley in Bridgend County Borough. Next slide, please, Gareth. So the photograph there is Caerau. It's a South Wales Valley community. It's typical of, I suppose, a post-industrial community in the UK or anywhere else for that matter. The colliery there closed in 1977, and it's typically suffered the sort of economic and social problems that you normally associate with an area that was reliant on one particular industry, and that particular industry is no longer there. So if you look at the statistics and look at the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation, Caerau is the 5th most deprived ward in the whole of Wales. And it typically has some of those problems that you associate with the deprived community. So if you look at the housing, I don't know if you can see it from the picture, but it's predominantly terrace housing, which typically suffers from damp problems, isn't particularly energy efficient. So as you can imagine, there's going to be high levels of fuel poverty in the area. If you have damp housing that's not heated properly, there's going to be health problems in there. So there's statistics again tell us there's some long-term debilitating health conditions there. There's high levels of unemployment and low levels of educational attainment. So there shouldn't be any, I suppose, surprises in there. Those are typical problems that you find in lots of deprived post-industrial communities across the UK and Europe as well. Next slide, please, Gareth. So the project we targeted at Caerau, and it was, I suppose, it was a challenge because it's a difficult place to start. The market doesn't normally design solutions for communities like that. It targets the ability to pay market, and you would probably class Caerau as not high on your priorities as an ability to pay market, really. But the challenge for us was, how do you decarbonise a community like that? How do you ensure that the decarbonised energy system serves them better than the current carbonised energy system, really? So that how you decarbonise an area like this was a prime target as to why we looked at this particular project. And there were some sort of subsidiary targets in there as well, really, around how do you enhance energy resilience in the area. If we recognise that the decarbonisation of the energy system is going to be an economic opportunity as well as an environmental opportunity, well, how do you make some of those opportunities, should we say, sticky in the area, and when we get genuine economic regeneration? So that was another priority, a challenge in there. How do we reduce fuel poverty? We would like the decarbonised energy system to be perhaps fairer. And common sense tells us that if we're going to try and reduce people's bills, make their homes warmer, make them drier, make them brighter, that's going to have a positive impact on health as well, albeit that's perhaps a little more difficult to prove or make that direct link, shall we say. Next slide, please, Gareth. So the characteristics of the area in which we started the project was it's a high fuel poor area. I think it's classed statistically as extreme fuel poverty. There's a high percentage of private sector owned housing there, and that housing is predominantly older housing, so it's that pre-1919 terrace properties, and the private sector housing is a real mix of privately rented and owner-occupied housing, really. We considered that mine water was an abundant resource below the village, albeit we couldn't prove it at the beginning, but sort of conversations with others in the sector could have told us that there was possibly an opportunity here. We really considered that heat network was the best way of tapping into that resource and bringing it to the homes of all of the residents, or as many as wanted to connect. But there was an absence of the traditional public sector buildings that you see in normal heat networks, that anchors those anchor buildings that make the networks financially viable, really. I suppose another characteristic asset of the area was the presence of wind resource. So if you stood in the village and looked at the eastern side of the valley or the northern part of the valley, you would see wind turbines dotting all over the valley there, and you actually thought, well, that's a resource that's currently not directly benefiting the residents, but could it? Next slide, please, Gareth. So for this project, it sort of went on a little bit of a journey, shall we say, starting in 2015. when we looked at completing a master plan for the area. That was led by Cardiff University, and that sort of looked at mine water as an option against other options for decarbonised heat. So it looked at biomass, it looked at traditional ground or air, and it sort of concluded that there was an opportunity there with mine water. Really, we didn't know too much about it at that stage, but the conclusion was very high level study. It had opportunities. And something that we would warrant further investigation. So that moved forward for a feasibility study, which was completed in early 2018. Again, that was led by Cardiff University, and it was a consortium approach to deliver that feasibility study. And that, for the first time, started to we sank an investigative borehole as part of that, which I'll talk about a little later. And we also started looking at the economics of the project for the first time, and how the scheme would look and how it could be delivered. On the back of the feasibility study, we developed a business plan which we used to secure €7.5 million European Regional Development funding in 2019, and we are extremely grateful for the support that we've got from the Welsh European Funding Office with that ERDF funding. This is a high risk project firmly on that innovation curve, I suppose, and for them to support it like that has been hugely beneficial, and we wouldn't have got to where we are without that support, really. In 2020, then we commissioned Nordic Heat as consultants on the project to take the project then through to what we hope is construction and delivery of a scheme in Caerau. Next slide, please, Gareth. So the borehole that we did in 2017 was an investigative borehole, and it was designed to give us some information. I mean, primarily, was mine water there, and at what temperature that water was. The drilling operation was carried out in the autumn there. It targeted a particular void which it encountered at 225 meters. The water level stabilized at about 92 meters below ground level, and it's been steadily rising ever since. I think the last test we did up there was July last year, and it was around 10 meters below ground level at that point. The temperature has been consistently at about 20 degrees, and we did some water chemistry analysis of that last summer as well, and the water was showing characteristics of mine water. I say the characteristics because there was a little uncertainty around the void that we'd encountered. Was it actually a seam or not, or was it a perched water table that was connected to the mine workings in some way? And the answer was we didn't really know. We thought it was, and the water chemistry tells us that it possibly is mine water. There are a number of things that point us in that direction, but really we needed to do more work with additional exploration of other boreholes, really, to understand what was it mine water. Was there a sufficient resource there to support what would be a commercial heat network project, really? Next slide, please, Gareth. So why is it that we were interested in the mine water? Well, we considered it was relatively abundant. We didn't know, but our sort of instinct told us that possibly it was, and it was a low source of carbon heat that was sitting there beneath the village, really. Temperature, that particularly from the bore study that we did, showed us that it was naturally elevated, and it was at a very high constant temperature, so that it was a resource there that could support the scheme. It was a sustainable resource, we hope, if we manage it correctly and how we manage it correctly, but the signs are that it at least could be. And it fitted in, I suppose, with our local area energy plan, which we developed with the Energy Systems Catapult, that showed that heat networks will be the solution to decarbonise heat in this particular area of the county borough, and it aligned with heat pump technology as well. Next slide, please, Gareth. So that sort of looks like, I suppose, it's what we first considered our development of a heat network in the village would look like. So that's the village of Caerau, sort of north to south, east to west. The area in amber, where the amber lines are, was where we considered our phase one would be located, based on the ERDF budget. And then the red areas would be the areas that would expand out afterwards, not in one hit, but more of organic growth, I suppose, over time. Next slide, please, Gareth. But as we started to develop the project, certainly through feasibility, but certainly as we got into that DPD stage, we started to tease out some of the barriers really to the development of the project, and some of those were below ground and some of those were above ground. First slide now looks at sort of the below ground risks, if you like, and it was the challenges around the economics of mine water. Gas is relatively inexpensive. It doesn't always feel that way, but it is, and you're up against the economics of gas really. There's a lot of uncertainty around the funding position for mine water projects. There isn't specific funds available that can help you deliver a mine water project. There's RHI in the UK, and we've got the ERDF funding, but they're not specific for mine water projects. And there are lots of nuances with mine water projects that mean I think it needs a different level of funding support, and certainly one that is not necessarily just about funding revenue to develop the project or capital to build it. What about the operational cost afterwards, and how can we support that? And there's nothing there at the moment that can kind of help you that end-to-end solution to make one of these projects work, particularly in a community like Caerau. You've got the borehole drilling costs. When we started to look at what our next stage of drilling looked like in terms of operational boreholes and how we could use those perhaps initially for investigative purposes, we suddenly realized the costs were a lot higher than we probably anticipated when we started the project, and with no certain outcome. So with our ERDF budget, we could frankly spend a significant amount of it, but without a certain outcome. You know, we may not hit the seam, or we may not feel that there's enough mine water there. We could have inconclusive results and not enough really to develop the project further on. So there was that understanding around, well, okay, where does that risk sit? Then there's the uncertainty over the resource. We can do a pump test and we can be confident that there's a resource there now, but how sustainable is that resource? How is the heat going to recharge in it? Is it that sustainable, or is it going to degrade over time? So there's a number of risks in there that currently, you know, we didn't have answers to. Next slide, please, Gareth. So that looks at the below ground risks. And then there's the above ground risks as well. So there's always the issue with the heat network. How do you get customers to connect to it? They have an existing technology, and whether that's usually existing individual gas boilers, why would they want to give that up to something that's a little unfamiliar to them? So that's the risk and a challenge. Heat networks often have tight margins. This one would be no different, perhaps even tighter than normal. And there's an absence of those anchor buildings in there, which doesn't make your business case look any better. Then there's the market appetite. Would somebody actually want to come in and deliver this project, given how high risk it was, and put their name to it? So there was a risk in there of whether anybody would want to come forward. There's the suitability of the properties. They're those leaky Victorian properties that have energy efficiency issues attached to them. So how suitable were they to move to what would be a low temperature heat network? And then there's the regulatory challenges then around having to get planning permission, water abstraction permits, heat access agreements, all from different bodies, all with quite long timescales and no streamlined way of engaging. So there are a number of project barriers that we started to uncover, and sort of say, okay, how do we develop a project within this environment? Next slide, please, Gareth. With Welsh Government support, we ran an SBRI competition that asked the question, how to make heat networks more affordable. So it was looking at the above ground risk primarily, and it was managed over 2 phases. So it was a 700k investment from Welsh Government with 200k in phase 1, and we're working through launching a phase 2 at the moment. And what that emerged is a number of ideas emerged, which we took forward in phase 1, which was possibly the introduction of a managed service as a way of recruiting customers. So you could start engaging with people, recruiting them to a managed service using their existing gas boiler, and that managed service is very much about trying to get people not to think about owning a boiler and buying gas, and more like buying a warm home. And if you can transition to that point where they think about a warm home, then you can transition them to a heat network or even something else down the line, because they're not thinking about owning a boiler and buying gas. They just want to buy a warm home. And is that a good way of recruiting customers? Then in an environment like Caerau, where there are no traditional anchor buildings, could we effectively manufacture our own? So what about putting greenhouses in and urban agriculture? And would that be an anchor building that could support a heat network as a byproduct, I suppose? How do we better use data to design schemes, rather than sort of estimating what people use and how much people use energy in their homes? What about linking to the managed service, put in sensors in, so we actually understand how much energy people use, when, where, and use that data to better design our schemes, so we're not over engineering our scheme and effectively over designing it then by putting in bigger pipes or bigger energy centers than we actually need. And then we also looked at different types of technology around the heat pump and how that could be optimized and other solutions brought forward, really. So as we were developing the project, the SPRI competition has been running last year with some of these innovative ideas, which we're looking to help us deliver a project in Caerau. Gareth, next slide, please. But sort of spring, summer last year, we kind of asked ourselves with Nordic Heat some challenging questions around, okay, to progress the project as we'd originally conceived it, we probably had to pass a number of tests, and these were some of the questions that we were asking ourselves. Was mine water affordable within our current budget? Given that what we knew about the borehole drilling costs being more than we anticipated, so okay, so could we effectively afford a mine water scheme? Where was that drilling risk going to sit? Was it going to sit with the projects? We were taking below ground risk and above ground risk. That's quite challenging. How are we going to recruit customers to the project? And that directly impacts upon how we can make the project financially viable post construction. We can estimate how many we think we need to get to a break even, profitability point of view. And how many will we recruit from the day? How long is it going to take us to get there? Those are all the questions that we asked ourselves, and we're going to be asked internally by our finance colleagues. And most importantly of all, could we deliver the scheme within the grant timescales? So the ERDF has been hugely important, but it comes with a drop dead end date of June 2023. And we always have to be mindful of that. It's not an open-ended sum of money that we can just use to develop the project as long as it takes. We have to develop something within that timeline, and that's, for a project like this, quite challenging. Next slide, please, Gareth. We asked those questions, and what we had to concede was, at the moment, we probably couldn't progress the project in the way that we'd originally conceived it as a heat network serving the village. So we started to break it down into, I suppose, mini projects that allow us to scale up later. So we've progressed with a private wire discussion from the wind farm about how we bring that low-cost electricity from the wind farm into the village, because that enables lots of things to happen. Focusing a mine water demonstrator on the school, because it's a council building, it's something we could control, and we can learn a lot more about a mine water scheme in a relatively safe environment, shall we say. Developing a heat network project for the Tudor estate, which is an estate on the western side of the village, where we can start building out a heat network, enabling it to actually transition to mine water at some point down the line, and we can actually get residents comfortable with a heat network operating in their village, and then link it back to the managed service around how we can expand that in the future. But also looking at some of the terrace houses in there and saying, well, is there another way that we could potentially decarbonise some of those homes that's not necessarily all about a heat network? So kind of conceding that maybe the heat network wasn't the right option for every single house in there, although we still think it's got a pretty important role to play in the village. So that's kind of the position that I suppose we got to in the autumn. Next slide, please, Gareth. So the direction of travel at the moment is we're developing the managed service proposal. We're looking to recruit about 50 houses, and that's ongoing at the moment. We're into the next stage of commercial discussions with the wind farm operator to bring the private wire connection into the village. We're developing the mini business cases around all 4 of those project options, and all 4 of those business cases have got that June 2023 sort of deadline in mind as to when this has to be delivered by. So I don't want that to end on a negative note, because we've certainly not moved away from mine water, but we've taken a more longer term, should we say, pragmatic approach, that recognising as we originally conceived it, it's not possible to make that jump in one leap of, unfortunately. So we probably take this longer term approach of organically developing things out, understanding more about mine water, getting that private wire connection, having a mechanism that enables us to recruit homes, and developing a heat network somewhere in the village, that those things will come together in the future, so we can properly use mine water in the way that we'd originally conceived. I think that's me done, Gareth. Thank you.